Welcome back to Philosophy of Mind. The two short readings from today are from the Ego Tunnel, where Thomas Metzinger argues that you are produced as a model of a self in the world. As we discussed earlier, his phenomenal self-model theory proposes that the self is a pattern of neural activity in relation to a world. In this chapter, Metzinger is considering 6 problems that need to be solved in order to explain why and how a self comes to be produced. The one world problem, why your experience is unified. The now problem, why your experience is temporally present. The reality problem, why it seems to you that you experience the world rather than your model of the world. The ineffability problem, why we can't provide a complete description of our experience to others. The evolution problem, what consciousness does. And then finally, the who problem, why you are a self. I'm only going to talk about the now problem and the who problem because I think Metzinger does a really good job of articulating those issues and connecting them to each other. Most consciousness theorists have dealt with the other problems in one way or another, but Metzinger is one of the few theorists who have really dealt with the now problem. And full disclosure, I'm also one of those consciousness theorists who thinks that the now problem is really integral to consciousness theory and thinks that we should talk more about it. So I really like this reading from Metzinger. He notes that the world doesn't come with a "you are here" sticker marked on it. Physical processes are continuous in space and time, and as Einstein showed, there's no way to determine that 2 moments are simultaneous except relative to a reference frame. The metaphysics of time is pretty complex, but luckily we don't need to deal with that here. In fact, responding to a particular environment, a particular place, a here, is essential to any biological organism. It's essential to functioning. Without responding to here appropriately, an organism would fail to get what it needs in order to survive and reproduce. It would just die if it wasn't able to get its nutrients here, if it wasn't able to see what was here relative to it. It doesn't matter what's there. You have to be able to get from here to there. But what is essential is to be able to exploit what's here and what's relative to here. Even more interesting is the way the mind develops the ability to mark now. Like here, any organism needs to coordinate its actions with now, with what's going on in the world right now. The space and time of the organism have to sync appropriately with the space and time of the world processes. And this is the interesting bit. Consciousness generates its own space-time model that manipulates world events to create what Metzinger calls a temporal gestalt. This is an internal now moment that specifies a particular reference frame for perception and action. He suggests that this window of moving now lasts about 3 seconds. Longer time frames are not perceived as connected. For example, very long German sentences are difficult to follow when you're in a lecture because they're too long. Metzinger considers the possibility that a now moment might be longer or shorter than it is for humans. And this is fun to kind of imagine. What would it be like to experience a day or a month as now? Or if the present moment is shortened, would you experience a lifetime in an hour, for example? While now might be longer or shorter, Metzinger argues that there is only one now. Anything that's present in consciousness is now. Consciousness is always now. But there couldn't be 2 nows. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a single self that's the subject of consciousness. And since we're talking about what it is to be a self, think for yourself. Whether this is correct. Is it necessary that there's only one now? Is it necessary that there is a now connected to your self? And could there be 2 nows connected to one self? What would that be like? Would multiple personalities necessarily have multiple now moments? Or how would that work? So try to imagine what it would be like to have more than one now, or to not have a now. Metzinger also points out that this internal space-time is an illusion. Like Seth, he says that consciousness constructs a world that does not exist. There are no colors and no present moment in the world. The mind creates them in order to serve a particular sort of function. It's also worth noting that the information about the world that's represented in consciousness is past. As we've already talked about, the delay for a signal to reach the sensory systems and be processed takes time. So any conscious representation of events lags slightly behind real-world events. The other problem to solve in the construction of a self model is the who problem. Why are you a self? We've seen that consciousness constructs a now moment. The question is, why put a self in the world as it is now? The beginning of this section usefully reminds us of the distinction between ontological reduction, which is an explanation of mental properties in terms of physical properties, and analytic reduction, which is a description of mental properties in terms of physical properties. Metzinger refers to this as epistemic reduction, but we're clever enough now to see that this is the same definition as we had earlier when we were talking about analytic reduction. As Metzinger notes, just because the self can't be described in physical terms does not mean it can't be explained in physical terms. The explanation, according to Metzinger, is that a self is constructed as a form of protection. First as a way for cells to distinguish inside from outside, later for the nervous system to distinguish my body from what is not my body, and then finally for consciousness to distinguish its own first-person perspective from the third-person perspective, that is, me from it. Note that in the very last sentence of this chapter, Metzinger says that the challenge of the who problem is to figure out why the consciousness tunnel turned into the ego tunnel. This implies that consciousness appears first. There's a real world now, and then afterwards, a self gets put in it. So think about whether this is the case. Can you have a consciousness without a self? What's it like to be a consciousness without a self? What does the self add to consciousness? The last point I want to talk about is the concept of the ego tunnel. And this is the idea that the world and the self are constructed internally. And this idea is connected to the idea that Seth was talking about, that the world is an illusion, that we are creating a world out of our perceptual input. No time or self actually exists. They are representations in the mind. So your mind represents just the right stimuli and just the right way for you particularly to survive, both as a species and as the particular person that you are. The image of the tunnel here is you. You're inside the tunnel, and your body and senses form the walls through which information passes. So what you want to think about is your experience and how you are, getting information from the world, that the world is coming to you. It's coming to you a little later than what's happening out there, and you're responding to it in various ways through your particular perceptual apparatus and your particular interpretations based on your history. These are your representations. This is the world that you create. And ask yourself if this is right. Is your reality fundamentally distinct from my reality? Even if we are indirectly connected to an out there that physics describes, in terms of all of the atoms floating about and sending us these signals? Do you think you're in a tunnel? Or are your representations directly about the world? So we'll talk later in the semester about this notion of indirect representation and contrast that with direct representation. And so get started thinking about this idea of the ego tunnel and this continue to connect that with the idea that the world is a hallucination. Is that how it seems to you? And if not, is that just because it's a good illusion and as Metzinger says, you can't, it's structured so that you can't know that you're having this illusion? Or is there a better way to think about these representations in order to explain the way your representations seem direct because they are direct.